Martin Holloway's morning routine had remained unchanged for 27 years. Each day began with black coffee on his wraparound porch, watching the neighborhood awaken beneath the sprawling canopy of his prized American chestnut tree, a 120-year-old botanical miracle that predated his Victorian home by several decades. Experts had valued it at $170,000, not just for its rarity as one of the few survivors of the blight that had decimated its species, but for the majestic beauty it lent to the historic Oak Ridge neighborhood. That Tuesday morning, however, Martin's coffee turned cold in his hand as he watched his new neighbor, Diane Wilcox, march across her recently acquired property line with determination in her stride and a chainsaw in her hands. "Excuse me," Martin called out, nearly spilling his coffee as he scrambled down the porch steps. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Diane, a woman in her early 50s with immaculately highlighted hair and designer gardening gloves, barely acknowledged him. "Taking care of this nuisance once and for all. Your tree drops branches on my new gazebo and the leaves clog my gutters." "That's a protected American chestnut," Martin said, his voice rising with each word. "You can't just—" The chainsaw roared to life, drowning out his protests. "Stop," Martin shouted, waving his arms frantically. "This is illegal. That tree is on my property." Diane revved the chainsaw again, her face a mask of suburban determination. 3 inches of it crosses my property line. I've checked the ordinances. I can remove what's on my side." "That's not how it works with heritage trees. Please stop and let's talk about this." But Diane had already made her first cut into the massive trunk, sending wood chips flying. Martin fumbled for his phone, dialing the police with trembling fingers while continuing to plead with his neighbor. "You don't understand what you're doing. This tree is one of only a few hundred mature American chestnuts left in the entire country." Officers were on their way, the dispatcher assured him, but Martin knew they wouldn't arrive in time. Diane had clearly done her research on tree removal techniques, if not arboreal law. She was making a perfect notch cut on the side facing her property. "At least let me get an arborist out here," Martin begged, stepping closer. "If it needs pruning, we can do it properly." Diane paused only long enough to wipe sweat from her brow. "I spent $30,000 on my backyard renovation. I'm not letting this monstrosity ruin it." The tree gave an ominous creak. Other neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion and the unmistakable sound of destruction. "Martin, what's happening?" called Eleanor from across the street, her morning newspaper forgotten in her hand. "She's cutting down the chestnut." Martin's voice cracked with desperation. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The massive trunk began to lean, not toward Martin's property as Diane had clearly intended, but in the opposite direction. Physics betrayed her amateur lumberjack skills as the ancient tree's weight shifted unpredictably. "Diane, move," Martin shouted, but it was too late. With a deafening series of cracks, the majestic chestnut began its descent directly toward Diane's driveway, where her brand-new Mercedes-Benz GLE coupe sat gleaming in the morning sun. The crash shook the ground beneath their feet. The canopy of branches embraced the luxury vehicle in a final, crushing hug of twisted metal and shattered glass. In the reigning silence that followed, Martin stared in horror at the destruction, not just of his irreplaceable tree, but of his neighbor's $80,000 car. The chainsaw lay abandoned on the ground, still idling as Diane's hands flew to her mouth in shock. And that was the moment when Martin Holloway's quiet, predictable life changed forever. The police arrived 15 minutes after the tree fell, by which time half the neighborhood had gathered around the spectacular disaster. Officer Jenkins, a 20-year veteran with a weathered face that had seen every manner of suburban dispute, took one look at the scene and radioed for backup. "Let me get this straight," he said after interviewing both parties. "Ms. Wilcox, you cut down this tree without permits or professional assistance, and now you're claiming Mr. Holloway is somehow responsible for the damage to your vehicle." Diane's shock had quickly transformed into righteous indignation. The tree was diseased. "Look at the trunk. See those dark spots?" It was a hazard that he refused to address despite my multiple requests. Martin's jaw dropped. "That's absolutely false. There was never a single conversation about the tree's health. Dr. Samuelson from the University Botanical Department inspected it just last spring and declared it perfectly healthy." Officer Jenkins scribbled notes while trying to maintain order as the neighbors began taking sides. Most longtime residents stood literally and figuratively behind Martin, while several newer homeowners from Diane's end of the street clustered around her, nodding sympathetically. "I have documentation," Martin continued, pulling out his phone to show email correspondence with the arborist. "This tree was a local landmark. The Arbor Foundation even featured it in their magazine last year." "Documentation won't bring back my car," Diane snapped, dabbing at non-existent tears with a monogrammed handkerchief, "or fix my gazebo, which has been bombarded with deadfall for months. My insurance agent is on his way." As if summoned by her words, a man in an impeccable suit emerged from a black Audi that had just pulled up. "Mrs. Wilcox, Gregory Palmer, Pinnacle Insurance." He surveyed the wreckage with practiced detachment before turning to Officer Jenkins. "I'll need a copy of the police report for our claim." Martin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Claim against whom? Palmer smiled thinly. "Preliminary assessment suggests negligence on the part of the tree owner for failure to maintain a hazardous tree." "That's absurd," Martin protested. "She cut it down. There are witnesses." "Yes," after repeated attempts to resolve the issue amicably, Diane interjected smoothly. "I have emails requesting that you trim back the overhanging branches. You ignored everyone." Martin stared at her in disbelief. "What emails? We've never corresponded about the tree. You moved in 6 weeks ago." "I'll need statements from everyone," Officer Jenkins announced, looking weary already. "And both parties should contact their insurance companies and lawyers." The word lawyers hung in the air like a threat. Martin had never sued anyone in his life nor been sued. He was a high school history teacher who spent his summers volunteering at the local historical society. Legal battles were not in his budget or his temperament. 3 days later, Martin sat across from Patricia Oakes, his insurance company's recommended attorney, in her cluttered downtown office. "They're actually going through with this," Patricia confirmed, sliding a document across her desk. "Diane Wilcox is suing you for $150,000 for the car, plus damages for emotional distress, and this is rich, loss of property value due to landscape degradation." Martin's hands trembled as he skimmed the lawsuit. "But she cut down my tree. How can she possibly? She's claiming you verbally gave her permission to trim the tree, then rescinded and caused a scene which distracted her during the process, leading to the accident." "That's a complete fabrication." Patricia nodded, removing her glasses. "Of course it is, but she's hired Terrence Fleming. He's known for turning victims into villains and vice versa. More importantly, her insurance company wants to avoid paying out on the Mercedes. They'll try to force your homeowner's policy to cover it." Martin's throat tightened. "What about my tree? It was worth far more than her car." "We're filing a countersuit," Patricia assured him. "But Martin, there's something else you should know." She hesitated, tapping a pen against her legal pad. "Diane Wilcox isn't just any new neighbor. Her husband is William Wilcox. Should that name mean something to me? He's the new district court judge, and Fleming has already requested that your case be heard in district court." Martin felt the blood drain from his face as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about a tree or a car anymore. He was up against someone with connections, resources, and apparently no scruples whatsoever. "So what do we do?" he asked quietly. Patricia's expression hardened with determination. "We fight, and we start by finding out who Diane Wilcox really is and what she's done before." "This is a pattern," Patricia announced as she spread photographs and documents across Martin's dining room table 1 week later. "Diane Wilcox, or should I say Diane Mercer Halston Barnett Wilcox, has played this game before." Martin stared at the collection of newspaper clippings, court records, and printed social media posts. "How did you find all this?" "I hired a private investigator who specializes in litigation backgrounds." Money well spent, Patricia tapped a faded newspaper article from 12 years earlier. "Allentown, Pennsylvania. Diane, then using her second husband's name Halston, sued her neighbors over a Coed pond she claimed damaged her foundation. She received a $75,000 settlement." "But what does this have to do with my tree?" "Keep looking," Patricia pointed to another article. "Charlotte, North Carolina, 8 years ago. She sued a neighbor claiming their irrigation system flooded her basement. Another settlement, this time for $62,000. Then in Springfield, Illinois, 4 years ago, a lawsuit against a neighborhood association for negligent maintenance of a retaining wall that supposedly threatened her property. Yet another settlement." Martin felt a chill run down his spine. "She's a professional plaintiff." "Exactly. And Judge William Wilcox is husband number 4. Each marriage has coincided with a move to a new state, each followed by litigation against neighbors or homeowners associations." Patricia's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a mystery solved. They target affluent neighborhoods with good insurance policies, create conflicts, then leverage his judicial connections to intimidate the opposition into settling. Martin collapsed into a chair. "So this was planned from the beginning? She bought the house next to mine specifically because of my tree?" "Probably not that specifically, but properties with unique features, like century-old trees, present opportunities for manufactured disputes." Patricia gathered the papers into a neat pile. "The good news is this completely changes our strategy. Instead of just defending you, we're going on the offensive." The next afternoon, Martin was pruning his rose bushes, the only significant landscaping left on his property, when a familiar Mercedes pulled into Diane's driveway. Not the crushed coupe which had been towed away, but a sleek black sit-in. A tall, silver-haired man in judicial robes stepped out. Martin felt a surge of anger at the sight of Judge Wilcox, the man who had recused himself from their case with great public reluctance due to personal connection, only to have his close colleague Judge Harrington assigned instead, a man known to be his former law partner. The judge noticed Martin watching and, to his surprise, walked directly toward the property line. "Mr. Holloway," he called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of the courtroom. "A word, if you don't mind." Martin set down his pruning shears carefully. "I'm not sure our attorneys would approve of us speaking directly." Judge Wilcox waved dismissively. "I'm not here as a litigant's spouse. I'm here as your neighbor, concerned about the unfortunate trajectory of events." He glanced meaningfully at the massive stump, all that remained of the American chestnut. "A shame about the tree, a great loss to the neighborhood's charm." Martin said nothing, waiting. "I understand your attorney has been investigating my wife," the judge continued, his tone cooling. "I should caution you that such tactics could be construed as harassment. Judge Harrington takes a particularly dim view of intimidation strategies." "Is that a threat, Your Honor?" Martin asked quietly. The judge's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A professional courtesy. These matters are always better resolved without protracted court battles. My wife is prepared to reduce her claim to $100,000 if we can settle this week. A reasonable offer, considering." "Considering what?" "That she deliberately destroyed my property and is now attempting to commit insurance fraud." Martin surprised himself with his boldness, or considering that this appears to be a pattern of behavior across 3 states. Judge Wilcox's face hardened. "Choose your accusations carefully, Mr. Holloway. Defamation carries significant penalties." "So does barratry," Martin replied, using the legal term for vexatious litigation that Patricia had taught him, "and judicial misconduct." A muscle twitched in the judge's jaw. "You're making a serious mistake." "No. I think the mistake was assuming I would roll over because of your position. You picked the wrong target this time." As the judge stalked back to his car, Martin's phone vibrated with a text from Patricia. "Good news. Found 3 of Diane's former neighbors willing to testify. Also, tree DNA sample preserved. UNIF. Lab confirms perfect health. Call me." Martin sat rigid in the deposition room as Diane Wilcox dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Her performance was flawless. The wounded neighbor, the responsible citizen who had only tried to protect the community from a hazardous tree. "And you had expressed concerns about this tree to Mr. Holloway on how many occasions?" Terrence Fleming asked, his voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy. "At least 3 times in person," Diane replied, her voice quavering just enough to suggest emotional distress without overplaying it. "And twice by email. I even offered to split the cost of removal. He refused each time, saying the tree was," she made air quotes with manicured fingers, "historically significant, and that I should just deal with it." Martin's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the conference table. Patricia placed a warning hand on his arm. "Let her dig her own grave," she whispered. "Every lie is another nail in our coffin when we present our evidence." Fleming continued his theatrical questioning. "And what happened on the morning of May 16th? Diane's eyes welled with fresh tears. "I consulted an arborist who confirmed the tree was diseased and posed an imminent danger. When Martin refused to address it, I felt I had no choice but to remove the portion overhanging my property for my family's safety." "Did Mr. Holloway give you permission to trim the tree?" "Initially, yes. He said, 'Do what you need to do.' But when I actually started, he became enraged, screaming and distracting me, which is why the tree fell, unfortunately, onto my car." Martin could barely contain himself. It was all lies, expertly crafted, utterly convincing lies. Fleming continued guiding Diane through her fictional narrative for another 40 minutes before finally concluding. "Your witness," he said to Patricia with smug confidence. Patricia approached Diane with measured steps, carrying a thin manila folder. "Mrs. Wilcox, you testified that you consulted an arborist who declared the tree diseased. Could you state that arborist's name for the record?" Diane blinked. "I don't recall his exact name. It was a company recommended by a friend." "I see. No receipt, no written assessment, no business card. It was a verbal consultation." Patricia nodded as if this made perfect sense. "And these emails you sent to Mr. Holloway expressing concern about the tree. I noticed they weren't included in the documentation your attorney provided during discovery." Diane shifted in her seat. "I believe they were submitted." "They were not," Patricia said flatly. "In fact, our forensic aid specialist has examined Mr. Holloway's email accounts and found no correspondence from you whatsoever regarding the tree or any other matter." "Perhaps they went to his spam folder," Fleming interjected. Patricia ignored him. "Mrs. Wilcox, are you familiar with the name Thomas Berger?" Diane's composure faltered slightly. "I don't believe so." "He was your neighbor in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 2013. You sued him over a koi pond." Patricia laid a newspaper clipping on the table. Or perhaps you remember the Hendersons from Charlotte, the Gutmans from Springfield. Fleming shot to his feet. Objection. This is harassment and completely irrelevant to the current case. On the contrary, Patricia replied calmly, it establishes a pattern of behavior directly relevant to Mrs. Wilcox's credibility and motives. Before Fleming could protest further, Patricia slid a document across the table. This is the certified arborist's report on the cross-section sample preserved from Mr. Holloway's tree. It confirms the tree was in perfect health with no signs of disease or structural weakness. Diane's mask of victimhood slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of cold calculation. And finally, Patricia said, reaching into her folder for a USB drive, we have security footage from the day before the incident showing you, your husband, and an unidentified male examining the tree. Care to explain why Judge Wilcox, who has publicly claimed no involvement in this matter, was surveying the tree with you before you cut it down? The deposition room fell silent. Fleming's face had gone pale. I think we need a recess, he said quickly. 3 hours later, Martin paced his living room while Patricia spoke with Fleming on the phone. When she finally hung up, her expression was unreadable. They're offering to drop the lawsuit entirely, she announced. No money changing hands, everyone walks away, and they'll cover their own legal fees. Martin stared at her in disbelief. After everything they've done, the tree, the lies, the harassment, they destroyed something irreplaceable, and now they just want to walk away. The headline of the Oak Ridge Tribune read, Judicial Investigation LAUMNCHD. Historic tree destruction leads to allegations of fraud pattern. Below it was a photograph of Martin's massive tree stump beside a smiling Martin from happier days when the American chessman had still towered majestically behind him. For 3 days, Martin had barely slept. After their evidence had been carefully passed to Eleanor's daughter and her journalist contacts, the events had unfolded with stunning rapidity. The story had been picked up not just by local media, but by regional news networks. Environmental groups had seized upon the destruction of the rare American chessman as a symbol of reckless disregard for natural heritage. Legal blogs were dissecting the ethics complaints against Judge Wilcox. And the Wilcox's moving truck remained half-loaded in their driveway, neither departing nor unpacking. They're trapped, Patricia explained during their morning strategy call. If they leave now, it looks like an admission of guilt. If they stay, they face mounting pressure as more of their past victims come forward. Indeed, since the story broke, 2 more of Diane's former neighbors had contacted Martin's legal team with similar accounts of manufactured disputes and lawsuits. The Judicial Ethics Committee had expanded its inquiry to include all cases Judge Wilcox had presided over involving property disputes or insurance claims. Martin stared out his window at the Wilcox house, where all curtains remained drawn. I still can't believe they tried to file a restraining order against me yesterday. Me, after they destroyed my tree and poisoned my garden. A desperate move, Patricia assured him. Judge Matsuda saw right through it and denied their petition. More importantly, our countersuit for the tree's value, property damage, and emotional distress has been assigned to Judge Watkins from the next county over. No connections to Wilcox. When will? Martin began, but a commotion outside interrupted him. 3 news vans had pulled up in front of the Wilcox house. A moment later, Judge Wilcox emerged, attempting to look dignified despite the circumstances. Reporters swarmed toward him, microphones extended. Though Martin couldn't hear the questions from inside his home, the judge's expression of controlled fury told him everything he needed to know. His doorbell rang, startling him. He opened it to find Eleanor, practically vibrating with excitement. Martin, you won't believe what's happening. The State Judicial Commission just announced they're broadening the investigation to include all 4 states where Wilcox has held judgeships. They're looking into every case where his wife was involved, even tangentially. Through his window, Martin watched the judge retreat back inside his house, pursued by questions he couldn't or wouldn't answer. That's not all, Eleanor continued breathlessly. Diane's Mercedes dealership called my nephew. He works in their service department. They're investigating whether the car she claimed was destroyed was actually the one she purchased. Apparently, the VIN number doesn't match the records for her most recent purchase. Martin felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. After weeks of being on the defensive of watching the Wilcoxes manipulate the system with practice ease, justice was finally coming from unexpected directions. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Turn on Channel 8 now. Martin grabbed his remote and switched on the television. A somber anchorwoman was mid-sentence. Confirmation that Judge William Wilcox has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. Sources within the courthouse indicate that evidence of potential judicial misconduct spanning multiple states prompted this sudden decision. They're finished, Eleanor whispered, eyes wide. The sound of screeching tires drew their attention back to the window. Diane Wilcox was backing her sit-in. Not the allegedly destroyed Mercedes, but another luxury vehicle out of their driveway at dangerous speed. The moving truck remained, doors open, half their possessions still visible inside. They're running, Martin realized. 3 days later, Martin sat across from District Attorney Helena Warren, listening intently as she explained the rapidly evolving situation. Judge Wilcox has agreed to surrender his law license rather than face disbarment proceedings, she explained. As for your neighbor, Mrs. Wilcox, or Ms. Mercer, as she now prefers to be called, she's facing multiple charges of insurance fraud, perjury, and malicious destruction of property. Not just here, but in 3 other jurisdictions that have reopened cases based on new evidence.